My Hero Academia has been sort of between arcs for a while now. However, this time in between has been very focused on a specific thing, and can be classified as Deku's Rogue arc. We had the War arc, of course, which was week to week, full of excitement, reveals, and character growth. Things which we've covered more in depth in our War arc explained video, something you can find on the channel and check out after this video. Now, at the end of the war, of course, Shigaraki had lost control of his body to All For One, and at that time, Deku saw a Shigaraki that, in his own words, looked like he needed to be saved. This did two things: establish Deku's desire to save Shigaraki, not beat him, but save him. It also allowed Deku to see up close how All For One uses people, causing his hatred for him to deepen. I say hatred loosely, but essentially Deku from that time on has had much stronger feelings about All For One. These things laid the foundation for the Rogue arc, which would follow. Of course, after these events and the war in general, Deku would enter a deep sleep caused by the injuries he sustained during the brutal fight against Shigaraki, and possibly also by the previous user's desire to speak with him. And truthfully, he probably sustained more damage by overusing his power than he did from Shigaraki directly during that conflict. In this coma-like state, Deku would meet and speak with all of his previous predecessors, from Shimura Nana to the very first user of One For All. Before, they could only interact with him by connecting during those moments where he was not fully conscious, but from this moment forward, they would be able to connect with him at any time. 4 months before this time, One For All began growing rapidly, and along with that, the vestiges of the predecessors solidified more and gained the ability to communicate with each other. In this dreamlike world, Deku would be formally introduced to each previous user and learn of their stories. For example, how the fourth user, the previous holder of Danger Sense, died of old age due to the strain of multiple quirks eating away at his life. This information is what allowed the One For All predecessors to conclude that One For All could no longer be held by a normal person. One For All cannot be transferred anymore. Quirkless individuals are a rarity, and it's unlikely Deku would find another in need of this power anyway. From all this, it would be said that Deku is very likely the final wielder of One For All, something we had theorized prior to its reveal. This is likely another factor that contributed to the Rogue arc we would see following this dreamlike state. Deku already had a lot of weight on his shoulders, but to be told he is the final user, basically the final person with a chance of defeating All For One, was definitely a lot. Something like this magnifies the already existent sense of urgency he was facing. Failure was not an option. There was more said in this dream world, but they likely didn't contribute to the Rogue arc as much as the previous factors. However, we did further solidify the point that Deku wants to try to save Shigaraki. While this was all going on, society was collapsing. The aftermath of the war threw society back into a dark age where there was no law and order. The heroes lost the trust of the people, and the villains and opportunists were free to roam and cause chaos. Not only that, but the very heroes who the citizens began to lose trust in started retiring one after another. The dominoes kept falling, one by one. When Deku had finally woken up and healed a good amount of his injuries, the world was drastically different than the one he'd always known, and as the successor of All Might, the symbol of peace, it was his responsibility to clean it up, at least in his mind. All Might was very similar to Deku during his career. He put himself aside for the good of others. Deku has been showing this quality since the beginning of the series. It was only natural for him to take on all this by himself, or at least try to. And so, in his torn up costume, now holding the cape of Gran Torino, wearing a tired expression, Deku would begin his Rogue arc. That expression would only grow more and more grim from this point forward. His first act would be saving Shindo from Muscular, one of the jailbreakers. When he arrived on scene, he'd have his hood over his face, something we'd rarely seen previously. With his costume torn up, Deku looked menacing, but this was again only the beginning. Yet another quirk, this time Smokescreen, would make his debut, and from this point on, Deku would have his predecessors with him providing guidance. In the fight, Deku would try to reason with Muscular, even addressing him by his government name, but it was futile. Muscular could not be helped, at least not right now. And so, Deku would very easily crush him. When we saw Deku's behavior during this time, we all believed Deku had not really changed. It only progressed until this was no longer true. At this time, he was still in contact with All Might, receiving guidance and support, and we learned that All Might acquired special gauntlets from America that would allow Deku to use much of his power without causing damage to his own body. Deku would work along with All Might and the other top heroes like Hawks and Endeavor while taking down threats and searching for information on All For One's whereabouts. Everything Deku had done up to this point in the war and going forward was a genuine effort to do what he considered the right thing. He would keep his distance from Yue and everyone else because he didn't want to endanger them. Shigaraki possessed the quirk Search, so it was possible to locate Deku at any time. He'd explained this to his mother and All Might while remembering the damage the war caused to people like Aizawa, Gran Torino, and Bakugo. It was also important to stop Shigaraki and All For One before they became even stronger. And not just stronger, but before they became able to steal One For All. Before Shigaraki's body is prepared, and All For One gets what he wants. After explaining all this to his mom before the start of the Rogue arc, ending the conversation by hugging her and saying he has to go, but he'll come back home to her after it's all said and done. While Deku was no longer the same bright hero, he early on was still cooperating with the top heroes. That would change later though. Time would pass and the search would continue without any leads on the location of Shigaraki. Things were tense around the country at this time and not improving. The people were tired of heroes and not only blamed them for the actions of villains like Shigaraki and Dabi, but also the escaped prisoners, and it became even worse than that because the media was closing in on the fact that the villains were targeting Deku. The heroes weren't being fully transparent, for good reason, but it was continuing to hurt their reputation. There was a major event one night around this span of time. All Might had been driving around following Deku, who he'd observed hadn't been getting much sleep. A concern that would remind him of how Night Eye would care for him in the past, care which he would shrug off back then. He couldn't speak up to Deku. All Might knew him and Deku were basically the same. Deku's GPS signal would disappear suddenly on that night. His tracker was destroyed by Lady Nagan. Unlike the previous enemies he'd been stopping, this one did have ties to All For One directly. She was a senior for Hawks and someone so strong and terrifying that he would previously warn Deku that if she were his opponent, he should drop everything and run. Strong words from Hawks, but it says more about Nagan's ability than it does about Hawks' confidence. Nagan is the #1 shooter in the country. If it weren't for her, Snipe would be. The gap between him and her is drastic. She can do what his quirk does with skill alone, and from 3 kilometers compared to his 600 meters. Deku and Nagan would fight, and it was a close one until Deku eventually began to read her and gain the upper hand. It wasn't easy because not only did she have her initial quirk and skill, but All For One had also given her Airwalk. So she was essentially an unstoppable sniper that could always find an angle. Using Fajin, a quirk that makes use of kinetic energy, Deku was able to use a pseudo 100% One For All to stop her. Her backstory was a dark one. The Hero Commission used her as a killing machine, even killing people that had yet to commit a real crime, until she eventually killed the one giving her those commands, landing her in Tartarus, where she escaped during All For One's prison raid. Hearing this and seeing just how dark things were on the hero side as well, Deku would more so than before learn that things were not so black and white. By the end of the fight, Nagan would recognize Deku as a real hero, but just then, she would quite literally explode suddenly. All For One had prepared for something like this, as she fell from the sky after being moved by Deku, and now Hawks, who was on the scene, Nagan managed to reveal some information. The location which she was supposed to bring Deku within 2 months. This was dark. Deku literally saw her explode right in front of his face after hearing how the Hero Society had used her. She'd been used by both sides, the good and the bad. Deku looked rough now. With his mask off, he looked a way we'd never seen before. Things were progressing now in a big way. The top heroes and Deku would make their way to a location in Haibori Woods. As they went towards it, Deku would charge ahead of the group with anger, while Endeavor from behind told him not to be reckless. Still again wearing his mask, he looked menacing. This location would really just be a trap. All For One had a pre-recorded message playing for the heroes as they arrived. He'd essentially taunt them. Taunt Deku, he'd disrespect Nagan as well, and say that every battle grinds away at Deku. In the message, he'd also express his lack of interest in All Might now and make it clear that now it's Deku's turn. And with that, the mansion they were led to would explode. All For One was very much right in a lot of what he said. Nagan was unfortunately used, and Deku was in fact being grinded down by each battle. The progression in his appearance was proof of that. The next time we would see Deku after that explosion, he looked like death himself. He'd take out another hired gun with quickness. The panel of him standing over that body is just cold, and from that moment on, you could see he was even more broken down. The mask he wears based on All Might's appearance was now more close to representing a broken smile. After that fight, Deku would begin to leave the scene and tell All Might to be careful because like Nagan, this villain might explode. This was strange because regardless of whether the person is a hero or villain, Deku wouldn't typically say something like that so casually and leave on his own. It sounded like a lack of concern for the villain. All Might would try to stop Deku because he hadn't eaten in a while, but Deku would ignore that and tell All Might he no longer needs him to follow him around. He'd say that he's fine, as the words of All for One rang in his head, "It's your turn." All Might would try to reason with him, but it was no use. Deku would explain that what he's capable of now is on par with All Might's 100% with no recoil. The look of his mask as he says to All Might here to not worry about him is just sad. All Might knew Deku just wanted to protect him, he understood that, but even still, he did promise to protect Deku, so this was all heartbreaking to see. Deku would leave All Might here and continue on his own. Word of Deku would start spreading around. He moved without a sound, has a mess of quirks in him. He seems a lot like All for One or Nomu. The rumors say he's caked with blood and filth, which covers his many scars. Looking at him, you'd never guess he's a hero. Yeah, Deku no longer looked like a hero. In the process of trying to become their greatest, he became something else. The predecessors would now be concerned. His wounds hadn't fully healed, and it was not yet time to risk it all. They expressed this, but as they did, danger sense would kick in, and Deku would jet off in another direction without even acknowledging their words. The predecessors would talk among themselves and express their concerns, but the second user would say Deku is doing the right thing, seeking to save everyone as a true hero. But with that said, he still knew Deku needed help, and so he would say to the other users that there's only one thing that could bolster Deku right now, referring to Deku's friends as he looked at his own comrades inside of One for All. At the scene of the crime, he zoomed off to Deku would quickly be able to help the citizens in need. However, noticing his multiple quirks, they would ask if he's working for All for One. He'd answer no of course, but they were skeptical nonetheless. How could they not be? Deku would then have danger sense trigger again and run off. En route to his destination, again the words of All for One would ring in his head, and it would continue to do so while he continued to save more people. He never forgot his comrades and family though. He believed that he was doing the right thing by leaving them during this time. After all, it was them he wanted to protect. He wanted to smile together with them again, but it was not that time yet. At the location of a later fight, he would encounter the dictator, who essentially had a quirk similar to Shinso's brainwash, controlling the masses that can only be stopped by knocking him out or by hurting the people he's controlling. It was a tough fight and Deku was drained. It was clear he was on his last legs. It looked like it was over for him. But as if on cue, Bakugo would appear, landing a strong attack on the dictator and putting an end to his abilities. Bakugo and Class 1A were not in support of Deku's actions. After finding out he'd left, they were concerned. Bakugo specifically knew what kind of person Deku is. He knew Deku would not consider his own well-being, and as you can see throughout this arc, that was definitely true. They contacted the principal of UA and Endeavor, who helped them find Deku and grant permission to bring him back to UA. The students had yet to begin their second year, and so Deku hadn't fallen behind during his time of absence. Now face to face with all of his friends, Deku still kept up his recent behaviors. He'd tell them he's fine and put on his mask, which acts as a fake smile. His classmates were determined to bring him back though, and he was determined to not go. And so, it looks like a fight is about to ensue. That is where we last ended off on the story, and it is the potential end of this rogue arc. While it would be cool to see Deku dominate his classmates, similar to how Mirio did a long time ago, he's tired at this point, too tired to win. Not only that, but you can tell emotionally he's starting to wane. I imagine they'll win, or the fight will stop soon, with Deku being willing to go back to UA. There isn't much deeper for Deku to fall during this arc. He's drained. It's time for the light to find its way back to his life, at least a little. I can't imagine Class 1A making a quick appearance then disappearing again after months of not being in the story. It's possible, sure, but I don't find that to be likely. Horikoshi himself hinted at Uraraka being a light of some sort in this later part of the story, and so it's very possible that could be beginning here. But what do you guys think? Is Deku's rogue arc over? If not, what else needs to happen? What else can happen? Hopefully this video explained the situation well enough for you guys, and of course as more develops we'll be here to have you guys covered. As always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to subscribe to Plarmer with notifications on, and drop a like to help out the channel. If you'd like to support us even more, check out our Patreon link in the description below, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter, where we keep you up to date on all things anime and manga, and also do things like giveaways and going live discussing things with you guys. Until next time, keep that Plarmer on you. I'm KJ, have a great day, goodbye.